All right, let's take a look at the definition of posture. And so historically, there's been a lot of information about posture that's come towards us, and typically it's always defined as the body and a relative alignment of the body parts, in particular the musculoskeletal system. And that's basically what we're going to start with, but we're also going to, in our context, going to include what the fascia is doing, what the connective tissue is kind of doing, and essentially we're looking at what representation does one segment have to another in order to effectively establish some efficient movement. And so that's what posture is, and posture is always changing. And that's the kind of the key components that we want to stress, is that posture should never be viewed as a static thing, but more as a combination of holding different positions and moving through different positions. And so posture should fulfill kind of three functions according to Martin and his research. It should maintain the alignment of the body segments in all positions. And so whether we're standing, whether we're sitting, whether we're quadruped, whether we're prone or supine laying down, all those positions need an efficiently moving system so that one segment versus another segment move correctly in order that we establish and maintain an effective moving whole. Posture should also anticipate change to facilitate some engagement in goal-directed movements such as reaching or stepping. In other words, there needs to be a coordinated manner by which the body and its segments produce a rhythmical fluidity from segment to segment to segment in order to achieve an efficient moving body. Lastly, posture should react to unexpected disturbances in balance. So wherever I'm moving in my center of gravity or my center of mass relative to my base of support, I should always have the body in a fluid manner adjusting itself so that it can create the proper postures at the appropriate times so that I can move effectively. And we've kind of all seen that. If we stand in one position for too long and we think about the marching band or the guard that has to stay on guard for too long, if they can't have that small perturbations, those small little rhythmical actions, what happens by holding a certain posture for too long is they may get a lack of blood flow and actually pass out. And so it's very important for us that we think about posture being a dynamic process. And think about it this way, is that posture expresses itself for more times than not in action. So posture in action may be better described as acture. Think about it as acture, posture in action. And that might reframe it at least so that we're not holding certain positions for too long, but rather taking a look at how one aspect affects another aspect to elicit an effectively moving system. By understanding posture and the principles of posture, the principles of how one joint is representing another joint or how that interface occurs and what that looks like, we can actually better prescribe motion. So if I have a client that comes in to see me and they're hunched over, and what happens as they're hunched over is as soon as I have a movement in my thoracic spine, my shoulder blades, by virtue of that relationship, start to wing out. I may think that's not the best posture to load an individual up in a squat. And we kind of can clearly see that because we want to have some strength and we want to have some relative alignment when we place an external force on through the structure so that as I go through a squat pattern, I'm not actually straining the soft tissues because I'm bled or I'm out of neutral so far that I'm hanging out on one end of neutral. It's very important that we see where our postures are before we prescribe exercises, and especially when we put speed or some sort of external load upon the body, we want to have a general observation of what kind of posture is being presented to me today. Optimum posture, which again is always changing, remember, optimum posture is referred to as the minimal expenditure of energy to maintain its positions and move around. Globally, we call that efficiency. So can we have an efficiently moving system so that we can minimize energy expenditure? And that is good posture. If I'm energy expensive in my movement, that means that I'm utilizing a lot of energy, and typically, as we're going to find out, that means typically that one aspect of the body is fighting the other aspect of the body to create some sort of stability. So that's the scenario we don't want to be in. We want to be in the position or the scenario where there's minimal energy expenditure and one body part can help rather than hinder the other body part. There are three components that we're going to kind of keep in the back of our mind as we look at posture. And this is going to become more clear the more you go through the certification or the educational process. But for right now, keep this in the back of your mind. The components are the muscular components. When we look at posture, we've got to consider what relationship do the muscles exhibit themselves in? Are they tight? Are they longer? Are they tight in one area and longer in another area? Do we need to address those things as we address posture? So those are all the elastic structures and components of the body. The next is the neural components. And a lot of times when we look at posture, we don't consider the neural components. And that is coordination and rhythm. If I'm moving around and I'm coordinated and rhythmical, it means that from a postural perspective, all my structures are getting along with themselves and moving to the right place at the right time. And that's all mediated by the nervous system. If my structures are not moving at the right place at the right time, the nervous system will kind of react to that and typically hold and bound our body down so that it's tight. If that's the case, we're not moving correctly anyway. And so we need to keep in the back of our mind that the nervous system, the coordination and the rhythm become very important. Lastly, but certainly not leastly, is the connective tissue. That is very active in posture. When we start to work at a computer all day long and I'm hunched over, what happens is the fascial components of the body, which are very dynamic, begin to lay down new structure. They lay down more of themselves, if you will, to lock our bodies into that position. So if I'm sitting at a computer desk all day long and I'm typing away, there's probably a lot of strain in my upper neck, and the fascial systems react by laying down more fascia to that area, essentially gluing myself in this posture. So if that's my world and that's my posture, and I can't really move out of that posture, everything that I do is going to be more energy expensive because my body has to fight itself to try to move around. So those three areas keep in the back of your mind as we view posture. We have both what's considered good posture and poor posture. Overarchingly, good posture is energy efficient and poor posture is energy expensive. And so good posture is the state of the muscular and skeletal system in balance. So it's the muscles, it's the nervous system, it's the fascial system, it's the skeleton of our body that basically can move well in all planes of motion at the right time. Poor posture, by virtue of contrast, is a relationship that the body is not efficient in. It's one aspect of the body fighting the other aspect of the body. So for instance, going back to that hunched over example, if I'm hunched over and I want to rotate the spine, but I've bled or I've used up all my sagittal motion, and that's where I start from, the thoracic segments are kind of blocked. In other words, they're kind of folding in on themselves, and then they can't really express their rotation very well. So at that point, the body says, I can't really rotate at the spine very well, especially the thoracic spine, because it's locked in the sagittal plane. So I'm going to have to use all these different aberrant movements and too much movements perhaps in other areas of the body to get the job done. And that typically means too much movement from the lumbar segments. So if that's the case, we become more energy expensive. And so it's just basically taking a look at there's good ways to move and there's poor ways to move. And there's good postures and bad postures, but they all, again, come back to this idea that are we efficient or are we expensive in our energy? The implications of poor posture are many. If a body compensates, the entire body will compensate. In other words, if I have a distortion pattern up here, if I have a posture that's not ideal up here, I'm rounded, the entire body will reflexively mirror or adjust for that poor posture up here. So even though we look in our traditional views of posture, we look at segment by segment, we can't express to you enough the importance of the kinetic chain as a whole. If I affect one aspect of the chain, the whole chain starts to adjust. And so that is a big thing, because if I have a glitch here in the shoulder, that becomes more of a body problem because that posture that's poor up here expresses itself in the whole. Now, Shirley Sahrmann in her work in 2002 looked at the repeated movements and the repeated patterns that individuals did. So office worker at the computer all day long, fixed in one position, the body glues down. If I'm at a supermarket and I'm doing the same pattern over and over again to check out groceries, that pattern of motion and that pattern of stress that enters the body will itself elicit a different response where more tissue is being laid down to distort my pattern and bring me out of that ideal posture, and I can't move as well. Also, individuals in a sporting context, if I'm in a specific phase of training for a golfer and that phase requires me to go through a lot of golf swings, I've got to remember as a trainer that, man, one of the byproducts of specificity is that I could actually lead that individual to poor posture. Because if all I'm doing is a sport-specific movement over and over again, I'm getting the same pattern of load through the system, and then the body will react by locking the system down in certain ways. So I've got to maintain at least a nice functional ability to move in all three planes, because if I'm doing specific actions, that will breed its own version of poor posture eventually, because I'm starting to migrate toward that pattern of stress. So if I'm a golfer going through that phase, I've got to remember that, hey, if I'm doing a lot of golf swings, I might have to take some remedial exercises to establish a better posture through the whole system. So that's key. Inappropriate exercises can exacerbate some faulty movement patterns, and that exacerbates tissue fatigue. Okay? Pain is another big aspect that we look at as it relates to faulty posture or poor posture. If I'm in poor posture, I have more mechanical stress in through my system. With more mechanical stress in through my system, what's going to happen is there's more energy and more tissue fatigue, and that stimulates a lot more of the nociceptive response because I have tissue wear and tear. If that's the case, what happens is pain will cause a contraction of a muscle, typically in the tonic muscles, which increase the demand of energy. So we're not efficient anymore, we're expensive in our energy costs. And it's going to create more of a turning on of the muscles. If I'm turning on the muscles all the time, what happens is it starts to wear out the joints too much. The muscles are designed to turn on and off, turn on and off, turn on and off in a rhythmical pattern. If they're always on, that always approximates the joints, and it has a tendency to kind of wear them out a little bit quicker. The other thing by having a muscle contracting all the time because of pain is you cause muscle ischemia. Now, an ischemic muscle is one that has reduced blood flow. So if I can't get enough blood into the muscle, I can't have an effective working muscle, and I can't get rid of the appropriate waste that I've collected in that muscle. So I start to disrupt the mechanics of the muscle itself because it's not nourished with the oxygen that it needs to properly work. So that's a big thing that we have to take into account, is if I'm stuck in a posture and the muscles are tight and they're fighting themselves and I'm energy expensive and there's pain, what happens to the physiology of the muscle? Now let's take a look at the posture in the context, in this case, of the head. Take a look at the two pictures that you see in front of you. You have a smiley face and you have a not so smiley face. The smiley face is a natural curve to the cervical spine. And you can read the bullet points of how the spine, the cervical spine and the head have influence on the rest of the body. So it comprises 7% of the body weight. If the head comes forward, the activity of the extensors in the back of the neck increase substantially. Because now, if I take the head and I have it properly aligned over the rest of the body, there's not much muscular activity that's needed to control the head. But if I lift it or shift it forward, now I've created a torque. And my body has to compensate for that torque to control it, to reel it back in. So now the muscular activity goes way up. And if that is how my head presents itself all the time, then these muscles and this fascia and this area of the body will have too much stress too often and will react and essentially lead to poor posture. There's a reduced blood flow, as we talked about before, because of the tightening of muscles, and that could lead to trigger points. So you could have areas where it's painful to the touch, and that's because the muscles are always under a tension, and there's a reduced blood flow and a reduced elimination of waste. And a fact that is quite amazing when you think about it is, if we took the head and for every degree or every inch that we move it forward, the torque of the head doubles. In other words, the weight and the torque that the head represents in the body doubles. So if I take your chin and move it an inch forward, it's a lot more energy expensive for the system because it has to fight it. And so what we have is a lot of flexion in the distal cervical vertebra and a lot of extension at the more superficial or superior cervical vertebra. So we start to distort the shape and the structure of the neck. If we disrupt the shape of the neck and the arch of the neck, that is received in the rest of the body. Everything begins to distort. So what we're going to do right now is take a look at postural viewing in more of a local way, in more of a segment by segment way. And this is sometimes referred to as the traditional viewpoint. And when we look at this, it says that inefficiency occurs when a muscle shortens and then its antagonist is stretched and lengthened. So the classic view of a linked view of posture is if I have tightness in through my hip flexors, my gluteus muscles will have a tendency to be longer. And here's the reason why. Is everybody put your hands on your hips. If you're seated, please stand. Just try the standing up. It makes it a little bit more fun and probably means a little bit more as well. Take your hands on your hips, and if you shift your pelvis forward to an anterior tilt, imagine if you were those hip flexors and I tilted my pelvis forward. You could imagine that those muscles would shorten up. And if they shortened up on the posterior aspect of the body, you would notice that by association, the gluteus muscles would lengthen out. So right away you're thinking, wow, if my posture exhibits itself in an anterior tilt all the time, I have a representation of the muscular system that these muscles will have a tendency to shorten up and adapt in that position. And then my glute muscles behind me would have a lengthening, and they would also adapt to that position if that's all I do is represent this posture here. So that becomes interesting because the dynamics of that area of the body start to shift a little bit. And taking a look at the difference between the tightness in one area and the lengthening of the other area, it's also important to consider some of the fiber typing. And at this point, we'll make mention of the fiber typing again. Now, you'll remember back to the muscular lecture, I spoke about fast twitch and slow twitch muscle. As a general rule, fast twitch are those muscles and motor units that are typically more prevalent in the sprinters, if you will. So they're fast to explode, and they give you a high force, but they will reach their threshold of contraction later. In other words, they won't contract first. The slow twitch are going to be your proverbial marathon runners. They are slow to fatigue. They're kind of more postural in nature. They can kind of contract for a longer period of time, and they are the ones that contract first in the whole spectrum of contraction because they have a smaller motor unit. So they actually depolarize and contract quicker. And so in looking at this, if you're looking at postural muscles, tonic muscles, the ones that kind of hold us in gravity for long periods of time, they are the ones that can contract for long periods of time. They're mainly slow twitch in nature. So we've got kind of tonic muscles that resist gravity. They're also strongly involved in posture because they have a slow rate of fatigue. We've got phasic muscles that are mainly used in movement, but in a lot of explosive movement and gross movement. In other words, the movements that we can really see as we walk around, play around, and just present ourselves in a field of gravity as we move. But most muscles have a tendency to have a mix. So it's just basically what percentage is higher. Do we have more of a percentage higher that's slow twitch, or do we have a higher percentage that's fast twitch? And most muscles have a combination of both. Now the key to remember is when we deal with posture, a lot of times the tight muscles that have a contraction, the hold of contraction, may be more tonic in nature. As we look at the implications for a muscle that's shortening, we've got to take a look at the morphology and the physiology. In other words, what happens to the structure of the muscle, but also what happens in the muscle itself. And so Yonda, in his work in the mid-'80s, did a lot of work at looking at a segment of the structure of our body. And one of his conclusions was that a tight or overactive muscle may hinder the opposing muscle group, the antagonist. So what you might hear as you go through the fitness industry is something called reciprocal inhibition. And all that means is that one muscle becomes tight and then it inhibits to a certain degree an antagonistic muscle to function. So let's just back up a little bit. If I'm looking at the body in terms of segments, one segment, another segment, another segment, another segment, and I'm taking a look at just that segment. So it could be that my pelvis is fixed and my femur is moving. So I'm just looking at the hip joint. I could say that tightness here, which represents itself as an anterior pelvic tilt, might cause kind of an inhibition to the glutes. So you could have an individual laying down on the ground doing a glute bridge. If they have tightness here, they may feel it all in the hamstrings and nothing in the glute. That's something called reciprocal inhibition. And as we look at the more global view of posture and the global view of anatomy and the global view of movement, reciprocal inhibition doesn't have as far-reaching effects. But when we take a look at link action, which we're doing here, remember what reciprocal inhibition means and how it has validity in the link-by-link view of the body. Another implication to muscle shortening is to understand the physiology of a tonic muscle. Now remember, tonic muscles, which are postural muscles in nature, they're the ones that can contract for long periods of time or longer periods of time. They are comprised of type 1 and smaller type 2 motor neurons, which means, guys, that they have a lower excitability threshold. And what that means is they can contract quicker than the phasic kind of type 2B muscles or the bigger, larger type 2 motor neurons. So all that means is they kind of the ones that contract first in the whole spectrum of muscles and their motor neurons. And by virtue of that, they can inhibit proper sequencing of motor control. So they can actually, by staying tight and by being overactive, they can actually get in the way of proper coordination, which gets in the way of properly efficient moving body. So it's always good to remember that as we go through this, is that tonic muscles contract first and they can stay on for a lot longer. That affects motion. The implications of a muscle lengthening are twofold. There's one on morphology, which is the structure, and there's one on physiology, which is kind of the innards of the muscle, if you will. Now imagine taking a muscle and having it right in front of you. And if I was to stretch that muscle, as you remember back from a muscle physiology lecture, what we have is kind of two overlapping proteins. And my fingers represent the kind of the protein globules that kind of hook onto one another, and they start to create that power stroke, or they kind of contract and pull towards each other so that the muscle starts to shorten. So if I take that muscle and begin to pull it more lengthening, can you see how there's less of the protein structures that overlap? In other words, they're really overlapping here, but as I take the muscle and stretch it, there's less overlap. Now, if there's less overlap, what happens is there's an altered length-tension relationship, because as I lengthen one muscle, there might be another muscle that's actually shortening and has more of the protein overlap. So what happens is that has a tendency to be stronger than the one that's lengthened. So the whole body starts to become out of balance and it begins to fight itself in order to effectively establish some stability before mobility. So that's the one key area that we have to remember. If a muscle's always long, it's not going to reach the same amount of threshold and strength that a tight, short muscle may, in fact, reach. The other one is if I take a muscle and lengthen it, what happens is the body's very clever. It realizes that I have less overlap. So in order to effectively get more overlap, it begins to put in more sarcomeres in through the muscle chain. So remember, the sarcomeres are the individual units of the muscle fiber itself. So if I have more of those little units in, it can't effectively shorten much anymore because there's too many sarcomeres in the series, and it loses its ability to contract forcefully. So realize this, that we change the structure of the muscle, and we also change its physiological ability to contract with force. And that's pretty big, because we need to know that if we're going through a power phase or if they want to have good enhanced movement, we want to make sure that the muscle can get along with itself. So a lengthened muscle will have structural and physiological changes.